Hello and welcome back to our study of Matthew. This is the third part in our study looking at the Gospel of Matthew. In particular, we're looking at the Gospel of Matthew through the lens of the Sermon on the Mount. What is it that the Sermon on the Mount reveals to us about Matthew's strategy, about how Matthew tells the story of Jesus and the particular angle that Matthew puts on it, and what the author of Matthew wants us to be able to gain from reading that Gospel account. So today we're picking up with Matthew chapter 6. We're going to be beginning in verse 1, going through verse 18, and we're going to look at a small portion of this. And then as we've done in the previous weeks, we're going to give particular attention to the pattern that Matthew presents that is used in this little set of teachings, because we can't go through every detail that pops up in these verses, but instead we're going to look at the pattern that applies to them, and then we're going to trace how that pattern appears in different segments of the lesson, and then from there we'll actually in the end encourage you to think about some practices of your own and how this pattern that Matthew uses to critique religious practice might actually be applied to practices that aren't mentioned in the text, and how we could actually apply and learn from the pattern that Matthew is trying to teach us rather than the specific examples only that Matthew gives us instead. So let's look at a quick review from last week. So the very first week we talked about Matthew and Mark, the comparisons between Matthew and Mark and the differences between their two gospels. We reviewed that again the second week, so we won't review it again the third week, but looking back at what we did last week as we looked at the Beatitudes. And as I mentioned in Matthew chapter 5, we gave attention to some of the patterns that appear in the Beatitudes, what it is that Jesus is, or what it is that Jesus is teaching, and then how Matthew is clustering them together in certain pairings, what it is that Matthew wants to communicate about the teachings of Jesus as well. Some of those things that we drew attention to were that the Beatitudes are intentionally paradoxical. So in 5:5, we have, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." And we said that in the paradox of, it is a paradox that those who are meek, those who we might equate the word meek with weak, those who are not in power, those who are not destructive or authoritative or any of those things, that it's paradoxical that those people would then inherit the earth, either as having the wealth and the possessions and the family lineage to inherit something, but then also the idea of the inheriting the earth having some type of also a notion of conquest as well. So it seems unlikely, paradoxical in this world, that those who are meek, those who hold back any type of power they have, would actually be the ones to then conquer and inherit the earth. We also talked about that those who need become those who actually have. So in the Beatitudes, those who need something in this world actually become in the future world what Matthew refers to as the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven. So those who are in need in this world, this earthly world, actually become those who have in the world to come. So an example of that, different from the one that we used last week, is that blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And so we have those who are currently mourning in this world compared with what will be their future reward, their reward in the kingdom of heaven, and that is that they will be comforted. And then we also mentioned that Matthew spiritualizes the Beatitudes. So some of these same teachings appear in the Gospel of Luke, especially in Luke chapter 6. And in comparison to where Luke very clearly focuses on the physical and the tangible impact of on people's lives, or on the distinction between the wealthy and the poor, Matthew tends to spiritualize that by adding little phrases to accompany these things. So Luke says, "Blessed are the poor." Matthew says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." So from that, we can deduce a number of hypothetical situations of why Matthew does this. But one of these may just simply be that Matthew wants this to become a kind of universal principle that everybody can apply, everybody can learn from. So even if you don't find yourself among the physically or economically poor, you should still learn from this beatitude, this blessing, that poorness is an attitude. It's not just a physical circumstances of life. So Matthew kind of spiritualizes some of these. So blessed are the poor in spirit is one example of those. One example of that spiritualizing that he does here. So something that comes from this that we kind of touched on and mentioned last week, but I want to summarize it in concrete words, concrete terminology now. is the Matthean contrast that we have here that pops up. And that is that the logic that applies to this world falls apart whenever it's applied to the world to come. And as we said, that is the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. So the logic that governs this current world that we are in cannot be taken over into the kingdom of heaven. And if it's attempted to be taken over into the kingdom of heaven, it falls apart. It doesn't work. And if we think about this as a coin, the flip side of this coin is essentially the same thing, just stated in reverse. That the logic of the kingdom of heaven is incomprehensible when we bring it into this world. So if we take the things that make sense in the kingdom of heaven, we bring them into this world and we try to justify them by this worldly standards to say these things make sense and here's the worldly logic of why it makes sense, it also falls apart. And that's part of what Matthew is trying to get across with not just the Beatitudes, but then we'll see with our instructions that we look at today as well, is this distinct contrast that exists between the logic of this world and the logic of the kingdom of heaven, and an attempt to bring these two realms over into each other. Matthew doesn't say that you can't bring these two things over into each other. He's actually specifically saying the opposite. He's saying that you actually need to take this heavenly logic, this heavenly way of thinking, this otherworldly way of thinking, and you need to bring it into this realm. But you need to recognize that when you do bring it into this realm, all of those who think according to this realm are not going to understand it. So that's something that comes out strongly in the Beatitudes. It's part of the reason why they appear so paradoxical, is because we're applying a kingdom value system to a worldly situation. And from a worldly perspective, it makes no sense. It makes no sense to say that the meek will inherit the earth. But Matthew nonetheless says, despite it not making sense in this world, we know that it makes sense in this heavenly kingdom, and therefore we pursue this even when it doesn't appear to make sense in this earthly realm. So that's kind of the Matthean contrast that we pick up here. It's really not a distinctly Matthean context, and a lot of people, if you read different New Testament literature, will refer, probably a more common way of referring to this is it just being an eschatological view. The view that there's a distinct separation in the ages of the world between the age that we now live in and the age that is to come. And so Matthew and many New Testament writers are encouraging us to begin to think with the logic of the kingdom that is to come, but in our current time of actually living in the present realm. So let's keep that in mind as we go through, because it's apparent in the Beatitudes, but it becomes even more striking and more apparent, or it provides the foundation for the instructions that we're going to look at today as well. So we'll see how this logic that's introduced in the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5 actually weaves its way all the way through the Sermon on the Mount. So we're going to try to keep that in mind as we go through each lesson, each of our remaining lessons. So looking today at Matthew chapter 6, we're going to look only at the first 18 verses, and then we're going to pick up next week looking at value in the sense of possessions and how we determine what worth is, those type of questions. But today I want us to look at the idea of the religious practices that Matthew addresses here in these verses. So the pattern that I've mentioned that we pay attention to throughout these verses is what I've labeled here just as the hypocrite pattern. But it's a very simple pattern. And once we identify it, and once we apply it to the specific, to the correct little segments of these verses, and by that I mean there's kind of two verse segments that appear here in these verses: Matthew 6, verses 2 through 4, verses 5 through 6, and then verses 16 through 18. And so once those verses are peeled out of their context and we read those kind of 3 2-verse sections together, that's a really confusing sentence to say. We read those 3 little clusters together, this pattern becomes very, very clear. And it also really helps clarify what it is that Matthew is trying to say with these verses, because it can get confusing. One thing that Matthew puts right here in the middle of this and kind of in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount is the Lord's Prayer. And it's going to be a travesty to some of you that I've actually chosen not to address the Lord's Prayer today in our session, because I want us to think about the pattern that Matthew presents and how we can apply that to our own lives. So we're actually going to set aside the Lord's Prayer from our discussion today and not give it the individual attention that it needs. But part of the reason this pattern can seem hard to follow if we just read the whole 18 verses together is that, for instance, Matthew inserts the Lord's Prayer directly into the middle of this section. So the Matthew 6 verses 5 and 6, and then their connection to verses 16 through 18 is hard to maintain if you're distracted or kind of taken down this road of looking at this segment that comes in the middle, and then Matthew comes back or brings back up this pattern again. So we're going to compare just those little short clustered groups together, and then focus on those for today. And hopefully we'll be able to, in a future lesson, reference back to the Lord's Prayer. We're not at all skipping it because it's unimportant. It's actually, you can make the case that it rests at the very center of the Sermon on the Mount. So it actually is the core of the Sermon on the Mount and provides a lot of theology for the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon and Matthew's Gospel as well. So it's unfortunate that time-wise we won't have time to cover it, but we will definitely be referencing back to it as we go through. So here's the hypocrite pattern. Very simple, as I said. If we label these kind of in part 1 and part 2. Part 1 has 3 parts. Matthew says, don't be like a hypocrite. Part B is he says that hypocrites do something in order to please people. And then part C is he says that those hypocrites who are trying to please people, part C is that they have already received their reward. Everything they're going to get out of their behavior, they're already receiving it, because the ultimate outcome that they can hope for is that people praise them and honor them for their behavior. So that's part 1. Part 2 is the direct contrast to that, where Matthew says, but instead be like this. And what this particular thing is different in each verse, but essentially what he says, and if we're to summarize them, is he said that instead, do this practice in private is generally the instruction he gives. So do these things alone by yourself in private. That's part 1, or part B. I'm sorry. That's part 2 of this instruction. And that's the first section of it. And then 2B is to please God. So if we do these things in private, then we actually please God instead of pleasing people. And then the third part of it, part C, is that whereas the hypocrite has already received their reward, the person who does these things to please God will actually receive their reward in the future. They will receive their full reward in the kingdom of heaven. So that's kind of the division of the pattern that Matthew follows here. Don't be a hypocrite who tries to please people, and in the attempt to please people already has their reward, but instead do things in private. Please God, and when you please God, you will have your reward in the future, even if you don't have it now. So we can start with this section with Matthew 6, verse 1, because Matthew introduces this pattern actually with the opening verse of this. So Matthew says in 6, verse 1, and this is here and throughout this lecture is the New Living Translation that I'm using. So Matthew 6, verse 1 says, watch out. Don't do your good deeds publicly to be admired by others, for then you will lose the reward from your Father in heaven. So Matthew 6, verse 1 sets out perfectly the first part of this pattern that I've already suggested is here. Don't do things publicly. Don't do it to be admired by other people. And if you do, you actually lose your reward from your Father in heaven. So let's look at a couple examples. There's 3 that Matthew provides here. So let's look at these 3 examples as we go through here and look at how Matthew applies them to particular practices and particular situations. So Matthew chapter 6, looking at verses 2 through 4, this is where Matthew gives instructions on giving. So we're looking not just at the general principle of not pleasing people, but now we're looking at a specific religious practice, almsgiving, helping the poor, giving to the needy. So he says, whenever you give to someone who is in need, don't do as the hypocrites do, blowing their trumpets in the synagogues and streets to call the attention to the acts of charity. I tell you the truth, they have already received all the reward that they will ever get. But when you give to someone in need, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Give your gifts in private, and your Father, who sees everything, will reward you. So we can see the pattern that we've already talked about here. Don't be like the hypocrites who blow trumpets in the street to announce their charity. They've already received everything they're going to receive. Instead, whenever you help somebody, don't even let your right hand know what your left hand is doing, or your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Give the gifts in private, and God, who knows everything, God will be the one who provides a reward to you. So a few things I want to point out about this verse as we go through. The hypocrites, the phrase we've already been using throughout this, can have the modern sense of which we traditionally use it today, of a person who kind of speaks out of both sides of their mouth, that says one thing and then actually does another. In the ancient context, it actually can just kind of have the sense here of, we might say that somebody who's grandstanding, right? Somebody who's doing things in order to please people, who's doing things in public view in order to get the public praise. So they appear to be doing something for one intention, such as giving. I'm giving in order to help those who are in need. But in truth, the true motive of what they're doing is they're doing this in order to gain the praise of other people. So it doesn't mean kind of the strict, like, opposite idea that we have with hypocrisy today, which is where you say one thing and you do the exact opposite. It just kind of has the idea of somebody who's grandstanding, who's putting on for other people, who's doing things in order to gain praise, and that so it's inauthentic in their motivation for doing these things. The other thing I want to draw attention to with this opening verse is that it mentions the synagogue here, blowing trumpets in the synagogues and the streets to call attention to their acts of charity. I've already mentioned this in a previous lecture of part 2, the idea of how reading critiques of the law and Jesus's alternative interpretations of the law has a traumatic history in New Testament literature, in the field of New Testament studies, in Christianity, and in the history of our world, of reading those passages as critiques against Judaism and against how Jews in particular behave. And we said last week that we want to be sure and give attention to the fact that Jesus is not saying, because you are Jews, you have misread the law, and because you are Jews, then you do these legalistic things. That Jesus is actually saying that because you are human, you tend to do these legalistic things. It just happens to be in a Jewish context that Jesus is speaking, and he's speaking of the Jewish law. So therefore, the focus of his attention is on Jewish practices. So I want to bring that up again here to say that when Jesus brings up the synagogue here in Matthew 6, this is not a specific critique that these two phrases, the hypocrite that appears here above in the beginning of verse 2, and then synagogue that appears immediately below, those two things aren't parallels here, right? That Jesus nowhere says in here that because you are Jews, you are behaving as hypocrites. He's saying, again, because humans have a tendency to grandstand and to want praise of people over praise of God, or present reward over future reward, because you're human, you have a tendency to do these things, and I'm telling you not to do them. Why is the synagogue mentioned then? The synagogue's mentioned because Jesus is speaking to a Jewish audience, and he wants to focus on what would be the maximum exposure that a person would have. What would be the place where someone could gain the maximum exposure for their action? And in the ancient world, pre-news, pre-internet, pre-newspaper, pre all of this mass communication, in-person gatherings were the place where you would gain maximum exposure. And so Jesus here picks the two most obvious of these, that the places where you would run into the most people for an ancient Jew would be in the synagogue and would be in the streets. So with these examples of the synagogue and the streets, Jesus is just highlighting the human tendency to want to gain praise from other people. If we were to convert this into our modern context, it might be, how are you broadcasting your charitable actions in school? Or how are you doing it in work? How are you doing it at church? How are you doing it at PTA meetings? How are you doing it on social media, which we'll talk about in just a minute? How are you doing this at your book clubs? How are you doing this at your gym, right? How are you broadcasting the good things that you're doing in order to get the people around you to be like, oh yeah, that so-and-so, that she or he's a good person. So the critique here is not, again, of the synagogue and the Jews particularly. It's of anywhere that humans tend to cluster and gather, and that provides an opportunity for us to kind of boast of our own things that we're doing. We see with the pattern as well that we've mentioned that Jesus's idea here is that because they're seeking the praise of people and they supposedly, we assume, gain that praise of people, then they've actually received all of the reward that they're going to get. That's everything. That's it. So the charity that you're doing for other people, if you're using it to gain and kind of boost your own ego and gain praise from other people, and you receive that praise, that's it. That's the maximum return you're going to receive on that. But then in verse 4, his encouragement is that instead we give gifts in private. And it just follows this kind of this simple pattern. Keep it a secret. God will know what you're doing. God will reward you. So that's the Matthean contrast, or Jesus's contrast here, to how public praise, how things are done for public praise, is instead we invert them and we do them secretly, and we rely on God knowing everything, and God being the one who recognizes how those gifts and acts are played out. So let's look at another example. We can move a little bit more quickly through this one as well. Now that we have the pattern in mind, and now that we've seen one example, Jesus turns to prayer. So he says, when you pray, don't be like the hypocrites. Again, the same phrase as before, who love to pray publicly on the street corners. So we have the streets again, and in the synagogues. So we have the synagogues, the public religious gatherings where everyone can see them. I tell you the truth that it is all the reward they will ever get. So almost the exact same scenario as before, just we've changed from giving to prayer. But when you pray, go away by yourself, shut the door behind you, and pray to your Father in private. Then your Father who sees everything will reward you. So again, with this pattern, we have the same thing in the end, that it's a prayer that's offered to the Father in private. It's the Father who sees things that are done in private, who will reward them. And so it's the future reward that one counts on, or the kingdom reward that one counts on, rather than the public or praise that one would receive. Now, the final example, so we've looked at giving and prayer, and now we're at fasting. In some ways, you could say this kind of summarizes the private religious life of an ancient person, giving to others, helping others, or particularly, let me say, the private religious life of a Jewish person. And that's the context that Jesus is teaching in here. So the giving, the charitable giving in order to help others, the prayer that one does in order to communicate dependence upon God, and then fasting. So we have these kind of three facets of what would be a private person's individual acts of worship. So it's not individualistic. We have a strong tendency in American churches and Western churches to think of that my religious beliefs or my convictions are my personal relationship with God, and that's the most important thing, and that, church or community or those type of things come secondary to my own convictions. That's not what I'm saying by this being the private life of one, but I'm saying the private life that accompanies the community. In addition to a communal act of worship and a communal participation, one also has to have private practice and private religious practices. And these three practices in a nutshell kind of summarize what those private practices would be for an ancient Jew, and then also for the earliest Christians as well. But something interesting happens here with the instruction on fasting. So let's pay attention to this. Chapter 6, verse 16 through 18. And when you do fast, don't make it obvious, as the hypocrites do, for they try to look miserable and disheveled, so people will admire them for their fasting. So the synagogue is gone, the street corner is gone, and instead of that, we get kind of a upping of one's game of pretense, that they're intentionally, not just presumably they're miserable and disheveled anyways from fasting, if they're doing any type of significant fasting, but they go above and beyond to intentionally make themselves look more miserable, more disheveled, so that other people will admire them for their fasting. I tell you the truth that this is the only reward that they will ever get, the same idea as before. But pay attention here to verse 17 and 18. But when you fast, comb your hair, wash your face, then no one will notice that you are fasting except your Father. So before, we had the idea of whatever you do in private, you just, or whatever act of worship you're doing, you do it in private. Maybe not secretively, just in private. You don't try to draw attention to yourself. You do it quietly, and you do it as an act of worship that you only intend for God to see. What I think is interesting about this fasting in verse 17 is that it goes from being a quiet act of worship to almost a covert act of worship, that you are not only trying to quietly do something, but you're actually actively being being secretive. You're hiding the fact that you are doing something religious. And I think that really draws our attention to the degree to which Jesus is trying to draw attention here to the importance of these acts being done for the proper motivation, and that motivation being one's communication and relationship with God, and not any type of reward from people or any type of reward from earthly sources that we might expect. So verse 17 and 18 again to close out these verses. But when you fast, comb your hair, wash your face, then no one will notice that you are fasting except your Father who knows what you do in private, and your Father who sees everything will reward you. So in general, verses 16 through 18 follow the same pattern that we've seen before. We just get that we get a little bit more emphasis on not just being quiet about your acts of worship, but actually keeping them on the down low and trying to hide that you're actually doing them in order to maintain the pure motivation that you need. So I want us to end by thinking just briefly about the idea of what this would mean translated into our modern context. So I've mentioned the synagogue and the streets being kind of two ancient forums where one would receive the most attention, where one would be able to gain the most exposure. That is not the case in our world today, right? I mean, those are still options. The street option really isn't that important. If we think about most streets, in American culture, we all drive cars. Nobody pays attention to people who aren't driving cars if you're walking on the side of the street. And if you think about the street preachers that you do see, how many of us stop and give them attention and pay attention to them? So the street, in a sense, is kind of no longer our public forum for discussion. The church, if we replace the synagogue with the church, if we're reading this in a Christian context, the church still remains a place where we can gain great exposure to a large number of people and great praise for charitable and good deeds that we're doing. So I think the church, that setting still remains one that is really critical for us to think about, of what it means for us to broadcast our good deeds in front of the people of the church when we're gathered together. And what's the balance between doing our private acts of worship and being engaged in a community where we hold each other up and encourage each other. So I think that's an interesting question that we have to consider. But I want us to think in the bigger context, and I think it's probably the bigger struggle for many of us in the Western world. And that is, I want to take a step back and think about a philosophical question for a minute. I'm sure you're all familiar with and have heard the saying, something along the lines of that: if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, does it make any sound? And, the philosophical question that is sometimes treated as silly is the question that if no one is around to witness something, how do we know it actually happened? And you would say, of course, a tree that falls in the woods makes sound. And the rebuttal would be, well, how do you know? Because no one was there to hear it. And if you were there to hear it, then you can't answer the question, because then the question is moot because it doesn't apply because somebody was there. So that's this kind of ancient philosophical question of, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, does it actually make a sound? I think the modern equivalent to that question for many of us in our lives seems to be, from a social perspective, that if something happens in our life, but no one is there to document it, then does it really happen? Right? And this is from a social media context of, if I eat a great meal and I don't post on, if I don't post on Snapchat that it was amazing, or I don't share with my friends in an instant message that I just had this incredible meal, or I don't take a picture and put it on Instagram, I don't send out a tweet, I don't do any of these things to share with others this incredible meal that I've had, then have I really had an incredible meal? And then I think we can see this as well. Let's talk about the individual first, and then we'll talk about the church. From the individual perspective, we can see this, I think, because it's very easy for us to be out doing some type of service, a day of service. Several weeks ago, I think there was a national day of service, and I know that my church put together several different events around the community that we all went out and helped with, doing different things and cleaning up parks and serving meals and doing those type of things. It's very easy while you're out cleaning up a park to pull out your phone, snap a selfie with a trash bag, and write something about out serving the kingdom and making the world better, or out to help people help to make my community a cleaner place, or something like that. So that raises the question for us then of, how are we doing those events privately? Why are we doing those events? Is there a sense in Matthew 6, verse 1, it actually says that if you do the things publicly, then you actually kind of you give up the reward that comes from them, because you've exchanged that future kingdom reward for a present reward. So it's kind of an and/or situation. So I think that's a good place for us to think in our personal lives of, where does the balance with social media, where does the balance with sharing with others the good things that we're doing, where does that balance come? I wonder if it can even be as simple as, writing that, hey, this morning in my devotional time, I read this great quote from so-and-so, and then you type out the quote, right? Where's the balance between that this is boasting to others that I've been reading and doing quiet time, and here's my quote to show you how insightful I am, versus the actual act of doing those things to learn humility and discipline from them. So I know that's an uncomfortable question. And I know that I pose it kind of in controversial terms of an either or, but I think it's worth us asking ourselves, and it's worth us considering where we line up with our practices. And some of us don't use social media, and some of us say, well, I'm not on all of those things that the kids are on these days, so I don't have to worry about it. It manifests in the same way, of you're on the phone with a friend and you mention that you've got to go because you've got this event that you're going to, or during prayer times you say, oh, I want to ask for prayer requests for this particular situation because I was out doing this and this came up, right? So if you're not on Instagram or TikTok or any of the social media things, like, these situations still come up, and we still find ways to slide them into conversations. So if we're not out on the street corner with a megaphone blasting about the amazing things we're doing, we're still in a group of 4 or 5 people giving hints about what the incredible things that we're doing in our life are. So I think those are worth us considering and worth us thinking about as we consider our own private practices. So I'm going to end us there for today. As I said, the Lord's Prayer is an essential part of this section. If you're reading this throughout the week on your own, I would encourage you to go back and read that and to think about how the Lord's Prayer integrates into this. Why does Matthew use these kind of 3 clusters that all follow this pattern? And then right in the middle of it, put the Lord's Prayer. What's the function of the Lord's Prayer there? Does the Lord's Prayer follow any of these patterns? Does it support the themes and the theology of these patterns? Or is it just a kind of a speed bump in the middle of this discussion about religious practices? So think about that in your own time this week. And then the other thing I would like for you to think about is, what is one practice, a religious practice that you engage in that is not one of these things, that is not giving, that is not prayer, and is not fasting? What's something that you personally do that you consider to be a private religious practice? And then how would this pattern apply to this practice? It might even be a useful exercise for you just to write it out, to write out 2 verses following this pattern of, when I do this particular thing that I do, I shouldn't do it like the hypocrites who do this publicly in order to gain praise, but instead I should do this, which is private, in order to make sure that I'm keeping my focus on the motivation of communion and relationship with God and not praise from people. So that might be an interesting exercise for you to work through this week as well. I hope that this discussion has been fruitful for you, and I hope that as you go throughout the week that it's able to shed some light on Matthew, on Jesus, and how Matthew views him, and the relevance of Jesus' teaching for the church, both the ancient church and for the church today as well.
Grace and peace, beloved friends, and welcome to our After Hours podcast. Thank you, Dr. Zane, for your lecture on Matthew 6. And we're here with Pastor Jeremy and our lead pastor, Jen, and we're with Lana and Charlie Stevens to have a conversation about Matthew 6 and about life and about faith. But to get us started, love to hear the faith tradition you all were raised in, that inherited faith that you had growing up. What tradition do you come from?
I grew up the daughter of a children's minister and pianist in the Southern Baptist tradition.
So you're following in family's footsteps as our children's director.
Yes. Well,
Yes.
yeah. So he was music
Right?
director. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Serving in ministry.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Very much. Church was like second home growing up.
I'm of mixed race.
Oh.
I'm half Filipino, and the other half is white, and it's of Irish descent. So, if anybody knows either of those cultures, I had no choice but to be raised Roman Catholic.
Right.
So, very much raised Roman Catholic. Catholic school. Our principal was a nun, Sister Mary Roach.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
That's unfortunate.
Yes,
That's really unfortunate.
I mean, it was
That
great
wasn't
fodder
something
for
you
the
made up.
kids.
I was like, oh,
You had to
this
be a
is like-
principal with that kind of name, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Ouch.
But yeah, so very ingrained in that culture. So it wasn't just the, going on Sundays, wasn't just like the Easter, Christmas crowd, very much the daily by going to a Catholic school up until 6th grade.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And Southern Baptist and Catholic, a lot of people joke that's you're a Methodist then if you
Right.
came within
Oh,
those two
really?
traditions somewhere in the
Interesting.
middle.
I was like,
Yeah.
We made a baby.
So this is coming out before Mother's Day. So, and this is an interesting scripture because this is where Jesus is talking about, okay, you've heard it said is what we talked about last week. But this is getting into don't be careful. You don't practice religion in front of people to draw their attention. And I think a lot of us, whether it was because of the faith we grew up in, and the generations that raised us, or separate, there was a lot of show about how we had to look and how we had to be and how we had to act. For me, it wasn't religion, but it was my parents, it was my mom. I think Lana and I have talked about the little white socks and the black Mary Jane shoes, and you had to wear those, and you just had to do certain things.
Yes.
Right. Which is exactly the opposite of what Jesus is talking about in our scripture today. So let me ask this just general question. What's the number one thing or number one or two things that you all wish someone had told you about faith and the church or God when you were your child's age that was maybe different than the message you received about faith or the church when you were your child's age?
Do you need a second?
I might. You
Okay,
go ahead.
this is like ordering food at a restaurant. I try to draw it out to give you as much
Thank you.
time.
I do. Because there's so many things that I just want to pick their
Because
apart.
I can already think about what it is because being raised Catholic and I did that all throughout high school, and then when I went to college it was kind of like the freedom of not having to adhere so strictly to the ritual and the routine. So I probably just like stepped away from doing anything kind of church-based at all during college until I started up with a Methodist church, actually Winter Park First United Methodist. But for me, I think what would have been fantastic to tell like younger Charlie being raised in a Catholic church is that you can have that relationship with God. I think even if they aren't so strictly saying it, because I know each different church and each different priest can be very different with how they interpret their role within a Catholic church. What is still seen by going to confessional and by the way that the relationship of the Bible is treated with people that attend Roman Catholic churches is there is this separation. Someone intercedes for you. Someone's the one that can take your thoughts, wishes, prayers, all those things to God for you. But until you are of a certain holiness, which means until you're a Monsignor, until you're a priest yourself, you may not be able to achieve that alone. So I wish that's something that I could have told younger Charlie, that just go ahead and just pray. Don't wait for someone else. Don't wait for Sunday morning at 11 to do it when we do it in the church, in the Mass. Go ahead and do it yourself. Go ahead and open the Bible yourself. You don't need to stick to what the yearly breakdown is or something like that, because there are books you'll never hit.
That's right.
Books you'll never ever touch. And I feel like I ended up not knowing so much about the Bible, even after having gone to a Catholic school for all those years, even after going to religion class. They had a whole religion class in there, and then also Sunday school. I felt like I walked away learning nothing, as much as I could have.
That's so interesting, Charlie. It's like just with the idea that there was a ceiling on how far you could go with your faith, it limited you from, or it made you feel like you didn't even want to go as far as you could.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, that's a great way to
the things that you
interpret
would
that,
do. Yeah, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because that's exactly what our scripture that we're taking from. But when you pray, go to your room, shut the door, pray to your Father who is present in that secret place. Your Father who sees what you do in secret will reward you. Not like, ooh, what your Father sees you do in secret, like you're trying to hide something, but like this is between you and God. Just have that relationship. Jesus is super clear in our scripture about that. But we as professional religious people have said, no, we're like the mediator somehow.
Yeah.
We take away the intimacy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what I hear you saying, Charlie. It's okay.
Yeah. And I think maybe that could have also just been, again, my particular experience. I don't want to blanket statement that for everybody. That specific church as an institution isn't a monolith. I'm sure there's different relationships and different ways that people are being taught to communicate. But for me, that was my biggest takeaway. So
that's so funny because I just had this conversation. My siblings went to Catholic school, which is really ironic because we're like 5th generation Methodist. And but my oldest one had just gone through confirmation in the Methodist, while his colleague or his fellow students in Catholic school was going through catechism. And so he would like argue with the nun and go, well, no, that's not what, what about this? And what about this? And the nun finally, Mother Superior, called my parents and said, could you tell, like, I appreciate the conversation, but I have to teach our kids these things. And your son is confusing. So
wait till they're at least done. Then you can go into some theological debates. I think for me, I think growing up Southern Baptist, it's funny listening to you because I was in the Bible all the time. Right. I know every single book of the Bible. I was 5 years old knowing and singing the books of the Bible and the groups in which they fall, like the law, the poetry. I can quote so many verses to you. I think what I would tell little Lana is that you don't have to do all of these things in order to be enough. I think somewhere it gets twisted. There's all of these things that you need to do to be acceptable, or else God is going to be angry at you. And so you're always trying to read these books to get better, but there's an underlying current of like, I'm not enough, I got enough, so I need to pray more. I need to do more. I need to do this, do this, do this, do this. And there's also a sense that a lot of it, because it's all of those things, there's a lack, for me, of like spirituality in your body. Like you don't feel it in a lot of ways. You have the head knowledge, you have those things, you're checking them off, but that spirituality, that knowing of like go deep within yourself and do that you're not, at least I wasn't taught to trust that. It was always go into the Bible, know those things, and I just never learned to trust that spirit within me. You had to look elsewhere for it. So even as an adult, I don't trust necessarily. And we're also taught like, seek God's will, but you're not necessarily taught to know your own will, and it gets twisted. And so you never really know what is yours.
Right.
And so, you just, growing up also in a purity culture, you just shut all that off. And so there's a very sense that you're not connected to yourself and spirituality. And there's also the hell thing of like, or else, you know, and so trying to always work and make sure that you're doing these things so that you can gain approval and be the good Christian.
That reminds me, Hillary McBride, who is a psychiatrist, and she also does a lot of work in faith. She said something recently in a tweet. She said, church abuse is when you are handed a voice of judgment and told it's the voice of God. Like an internal voice of judgment and told it's the voice of God. And I think a lot of us have really, truly struggled with that. I know I have as well in my upbringing. Yeah, those are all good thoughts.
And it is so interesting how, and there's so much research going on right now, not to take us in a tangent, but I think it's interesting as parents, yesterday, Lana, in social media, you talked about your child getting stung by a jellyfish and
Mm-hmm.
the pain that caused. And it's so interesting because it feels like somehow we are supposed to love God, mind, body, and soul, but somehow the church has told us to shut down our body,
Right.
which is where we feel all those gut instincts and feel the will and feel those. There is something to that. And so it's interesting to be able to parent and disassociate as a parent a child's body and their feelings, their pain and their feelings of guilt, which all is held by the body. But we say that that's not what you come to God with, which is weird, because that's where some of us understand the will and understand the decision making.
Yeah. I think in that verse particularly, when it talks about the mind, body, soul, I was like, the soul we worked on, but like body you didn't get, and mind, I don't feel like everything was going to the Bible, which is fine. But then I was never taught to think through it, to question it, to even set it aside and read other things. I mean, I don't know how many people in my church were like, it's the only book I need.
Right.
Yeah. And you go through seasons, you're like, well, yeah, I guess that makes sense.
Yeah.
All the answers I need in life are right there.
Which we come from John Wesley, who wrote books about everything,
Right.
medicine. And everything. We're like, how can that be the only book? I mean, John Wesley in the Bible, maybe, but not just that. Yeah, it's so fascinating.
Well, and that God's created all of that, mind, body, and spirit. That a holistic faith and theology would consider those things and value them equally. That who you are as a person, your own agency, your own decision making, your own feelings is connected to your spirit and who you are, the essence of you. So I hear you saying you would encourage little Lana to know that all of who you are.
Yes.
Yeah.
That would be that whole essence. And I think coming to St. Luke's and hearing like, you are good just as you are, like that beloved children of God that was never spoken over us. Maybe it was, but I don't remember. It was always, you are born sinful, and so you kind of have to work your way out of that. But just going, you are good as you are, was never spoken over us. So saying that to our children, saying it to the children of the church, and reminding them of that, because they're going to hear the opposite so much of their life. And I think coming here, that was one of the first places where I heard that, honestly.
How much of a difference does that make to just to hear when you're a child that you are good? Right? That you are good, and thinking about you guys as parents, and you guys both as individuals in your own faith journeys from where you started as children. I'm curious, as you navigate and continue to build your faith as we all are, how do you all navigate differences of opinions on theology or perspectives of God as you decide what to teach your kids about God?
That's a tough one, right? Because I feel like we've both come to maybe a very similar place now.
Yeah.
I know for me, my deconstructing as who is it, the skillet guy that's not really a big fan of that word right now. That for me really started when I left practicing Catholicism. So I maybe didn't realize it. That word wasn't really in, the zeitgeist of conversation at the time. But that's really when it started, when I could see, there's other ways of doing this. So for me, it was the first time attending like a contemporary service with Lana when we were first dating, because you want to impress the girl, so you want to go where she's going, and you hear music that is maybe wasn't written 1,000 years ago, and is something that you can kind of connect to, and something that unlocks different parts of your emotion. And you could say, that's the music manipulating you into that sort of place. But I am a musician, so I connect first and foremost with music and with artistry in that way. So to see that I could worship that way, and then to start reading the Bible on my own and see that King David worshiped that way, and that it's wholly acceptable to be, dancing. I'm not going to go as far as he did.
It's like his favorite story.
But just that you can have that freedom in worship, that it doesn't just have to be so right here in my hymnal. For me, that's really what kind of started me down that path of seeing that there's other ways. And I think I've been seeing you kind of on that.
It's so funny. you say
Differently,
it,
because it's a different
I'm coming
thing that
from
had
the
to
opposite
exactly.
of like raise your hands up, close your eyes as soon as that song starts, to a more traditional step by step. There is a rhythm to this, and taking away all of that. So for me, it's like I came from the opposite, and I'm learning to find the simplicity and the reasoning behind things. So I think one of the things, Jeremy, you said was like where we're finding theology. I think one of the things that I'm growing in regards to our children, based off of that mind, body, soul, mind especially, I grew up where evolution was like the devil's word. Yeah. So it was a horrible word. It did not exist, all of these things. And science is huge in Charlie's. And so when we got married, I was like, oh, okay.
That would be a different
Yeah.
response to your question 10 years ago.
Yeah. But
I think in that regard, because I'm very much, old Earth. Dinosaurs weren't on the ark. Like,
we just agreed to not talk about these things during the first few years of our marriage. So in having our kids and doing my own deconstructing and stepping away and starting to question things and doing all of that, I think for me, opening our sons' minds to science and evolution and dinosaurs and age Earth and what really happened and going, I don't know, and trying to learn how to explain the creation story as a story and not God's gospel truth on things, which when I started that was like, because you just believe it. So going through science, definitely in regards to feelings and letting them experience things and not shutting them down and saying, I am here if you need them. Let's find a solution. I came to a house that peace was above all else, and conflict, we just kind of put that under the rug. So a lot of things wasn't discussed. So allowing that to come out and allowing our kids to talk about those things, to question at a very young age.
I was going to say that when you said, I don't know, I think that may be something that maybe I didn't hear my parents say enough of that. Maybe it's okay for us not to know, but that means let's seek out the answer together.
Right.
You know, and then I think that's a fun bonding moment for us to have. But also it goes to show them that there's never a point in which we're stopping learning, that we're always growing and we're always changing, and that I'm not better than you because I'm older than you.
Yeah.
I'm not better than you because I'm your parent. I'm at a different phase in life, and there may be certain things I know that you don't know yet, but there's plenty of things I don't know also.
Yeah.
And I think that's good for them to see.
Yeah. And I think for me, like I said, being 5 years old, learning scripture, memorizing, I still find those fundamentally good as you go through your life and learning those scriptures and holding those truths. I also think it's important for them to understand them in context and to not, it's a balance for me, not forcing it, but allowing them to wonder about it and have questions about it and always pull it back to their life rather than just read this, know the story, answer the questions about the story.
Fill in the blank.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Good.
Yeah.
You know the story. And understanding what the Bible is, we'll be talking to our kids very differently about what it is rather than what I was raised, what it is.
So that leads me to think, you all have used the phrase deconstruction. We've talked about this a good bit as the pastors, especially getting into this Matthew series, where in some ways Jesus is doing some deconstruction for everyone who's listening.
Absolutely.
You have heard it said, but I tell you. He's not dismissing Scripture, right? And for me, the visual I have about deconstruction is your embedded faith, your bias, your culture is this kind of bookshelf filled with books, but also images and objects, and that they're the biases we were born with. And deconstruction for me is taking those things off the shelf, examining what it is and finding the value of it. And if there is no value, saying, well, this doesn't have to be on my shelf anymore.
Yeah.
So I wonder for you all, as you're in that process, what are those things that in your faith tradition that were worth value, that you put back on the shelf, that now you've examined it, you see depth and purpose behind it, that you want to make sure your boy, you got two
Yeah.
boys, know that value of that part of your faith. That's just really important for you to teach them about.
I think for me, I think prayer is a very big one in understanding that connection and that presence to God and going deep and being able to connect with the Spirit in that way, and learning how to be still with themselves in that. And I think in wrestling with like who God is, when you're deconstructing, you get down to that point of like, who's God? And helping our boys understand that God is not this man up with the big white beard who was evil, but loves, but could send you, but does it like that. And understanding that where we see God in our lives could be in the acts of love that we do for others and where we experience those things, and to see those. I think that's one of the things that I'm really good. And I think I've had conversations, like I was always very good in like me and God, but not necessarily always in doing other things for people and having that be an overflow of that. And so I think having our kids understand the serving of others, the looking at those on the margins and the minorities.
They're really good at that. They're really good at that. You know, like I feel like our son, and I don't know what we did. I don't want to claim it because I don't even think we did it. But he's giving out toys all the time to his classmates and stuff like that. If he has extra money, he gives it to like homeless people that we see sometimes at parks and stuff like that. He goes, that person looks hungry. And that's like allowance that he could have used to buy a Beyblade or something random. And he knows that he could have done something for himself with that, but he instead chose to give it.
Yeah.
You know, so whether I don't know how often we maybe verbalize that, but I think that is something that you're actively doing and something that you're modeling, because you know, kids, you can say, but they'll do what we do. You know, so I think he's doing what he sees. So I just want to encourage you in that. I think you're doing a great job.
I think we're just so good.
No, because it's something that makes me super emotional seeing my kids do that, because there's certain things that you can hammer in and hope they learn, but then when you just see them doing it without you having said anything, you just go like, okay, so for all the times that you feel like you're like, oh, why'd you forget to do that? Or oh, you did that. Or oh, the teacher says you did that. You know, to see him do something so genuine and just so thoughtless and selfless, I think is one of those moments where you go like, at the end of the day, all this stuff doesn't matter. We're not going to care about that 10 years from now. We're going to remember that little kid that took up to him a big portion of his finances and said someone else needs it, not me. You know?
You know, and the difference would be from what you said. You know, I grew up, we were born in sin. We would say that's the image of God in that child. That's the image of God coming out and teaching the rest of us what God does look like. And therein being the difference of the showiness is that, you know, some religions have taught our children you're sinful from the very beginning. There's nothing you could do. Like you already had 10 strikes against you. And he's showing us, nope, the image of God is in me. Just let me go and let me show you what God looks like.
That's so crazy, isn't it? I'm stuck ever since like back in Mark with imitating children is the way that we gain access to the kingdom of God. That's imitatable. Now you take what he's done and you think about how to apply that to your own life, even though you've already learned to share, but you get a fresh example through this person who's unclouded by the weirdness that is adult life. You know what I mean? That's so sheesh.
Yeah. It's been really interesting, I think, coming here, because like I said, there's so many things that you had to do. And even coming to St. Luke's and learning and growing here and boiling it down, like the kids, when we teach it and we ask those questions, they're like, just love others. Just love others. You know, it's such a simple answer, but you're like, that is like the core. It looks different as you get older and you learn to, you know, navigate stuff, but they get that. And then just going, well, how could you? And what does that look like? And stretching them. But there's such a freedom and simplicity in that I feel very responsible in teaching them that I didn't have as a kid.
No.
Well, thank you, Lana and Charlie, for spending some time with us and sharing some of your background and your experiences with life and faith, especially as parents who are raising kids in faith and trying to make sense of it all. For all of us as we go throughout this week, and we are diving into Matthew 6, verse 1 through 24, and thinking about these powerful texts that Jesus calls us all to. We hope and pray that this time will benefit you.